Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and ReEnchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below. Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and ReEnchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Walcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. This episode is a connecting overview of our first season. 14 episodes of stories, myths, and conversations with amazing people who are all helping us remember and re-enchant our world. One of the great mystics, preachers, and change makers of the 20th century, Howard Thurman, once said, "Ask not what the world needs from you, but what makes you come alive, because the world needs is people who are most fully alive." When I put that sentiment into the context of our current times, which includes being at the beginning of the Anthropocene age, in the midst of one of the 6th mass extinctions, this one largely caused by human-made pollutants, when climate change is already wreaking havoc to marshlands and floodplains, fire seasons and windstorms, when you've just been through a pandemic, and my daily news feed includes many stories about the war in Ukraine. In other words, when we are surrounded by death and the other legacies of colonization, I am astounded by the profundity and the bravery of Thurman's statement. In the context where so much is dying, he has complete bravery, courage, and confidence that what we need is people who are coming more fully alive. Life that incorporates rest and fallow times, suffering and death. Life that is vibrant. Life living in the heartbeat of Earth herself, Mama Tierra, Gaia, Pachamama. This gently spinning blue-green planet which we are a part of and which is our common home. We, who are living beings in a living being. Such vibrancy is what we need to keep remembering, by which I mean keep stitching back together the earth-human body. To remember is a somatic experience. It is the place from which narrative arises in our body, in our landscapes, and the interconnection between people and places. It is also entails the intellect, the spiritual, the heart. I keep finding that as I learn more about remembering, as I watch and guide my others, as well as in my own journey, as we go through different aspects of reconnecting, remembering both the pain of our disconnection from one another and ourselves, as well as the sheer bliss of our interconnectivity and the joyous power of becoming more fully alive. It is quite common that we find ourselves singing. Sometimes I mean quite literally singing, music pulsing through us and dance coming out of our bodies. Sometimes less literally music, but still a rhythm, a way of being in the dance of life. And it is this music, it is this way of being that I refer to when I describe ReEnchanting. Moving into a world where we are more fully alive, where our world, Earth herself, and the many species, including our own who live within her, can have a greater chances of living. This, I feel, is a process of remembering and ReEnchanting. Most often in today's world, we need to do a certain amount of detangling from the dominant culture, which for too long has been yielding a social economic system and a set of aspirations of lifestyle and professional options that are far from life-giving, by which I mean far from regenerative for all of life's species. This podcast is the Remembering and ReEnchanting podcast, and I am your hostess, Sara Jolena Wolcott. I live a rather miraculous life with my magical partner, Christine Hill, on the traditional homeland of the Mohican people on the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, in what is now known as the outskirts of Hudson, in the backyard of the Olana National Historic Site, alongside the Hudson River, sometimes known in other languages as the river that flows both ways. Most of these episodes in this first season were recorded here in the fertile rolling hills of the Hudson Valley. In this, our first season, I am so delighted to be able to bring you 14 episodes, including 8 conversations with amazing people, 4 myth-casting episodes where I take old myths and recast them for our times, and 2 storytelling episodes where I share a story from my own journey. Together, this set of episodes, a series, serves to introduce you to some of what it might mean to remember and re-enchant our world. Combined, they tell stories of turning the dominant cultural world inside out, finding what is often hidden in plain sight, and coming to drink from a regenerative source. Most of my guests have had their feet in multiple worlds, transcending multiple dimensions, which makes sense, given that I am often doing the same, stretching between what is and what was, what could have been and what might be, curving through time like one of our many rainbows in this vibrant, fertile valley. In this overview episode, I'm going to share a little bit about on this first series and can interconnect them. I'm doing this in part because it's not always easy to interconnect the episodes. They might seem a little bit random, but they're not. They're part of a collection of thought, of experience, of a journey that I'm inviting you to travel with us and to help us continue together. Each episode is independent and it stands alone. In part because part of my own gift is being able to weave together that which others don't always see as interwoven, to create the kaleidoscope out of the different colors and shapes and sounds. I am here going to point to some of the interconnections that can easily be missed in this first inaugural season. We start with an episode sharing how I learned about the potential of re-enchanting, or, as I sometimes refer to this episode, how I reluctantly had a spiritual awakening in India while searching for better solutions to climate change, and learned the power of re-enchanting is critical for recreating regenerative cultures. I do a lot of work in origin stories, and I like to play with which different origin points create different stories. This point in my personal and professional journey was when I went to India first on an assignment with the World Bank. That journey became a transformational experience, one where I can clearly say my life before and my life after my experience in India. And it is where I came to understand the importance of what I now refer to as ReEnchanting. So it seemed entirely appropriate to start this podcast with that episode. Here's a short dinner party version. I initially went as a social scientist working for the World Bank. I had a personal crisis. I became as a part of my ability to resolve that personal crisis, I became a singer-songwriter, walking and traveling from village to village, as asked, listening to people's stories and singing them back to them in song. Mind you, I'm not a particularly great singer. However, I have a big heart. And fortunately, I found and I learned and I experienced that music was able to cross the divide across language and culture, the seemingly insurmountable distance of connecting with another person. In the process, I learned that art and music, dance and ritual, mythology and other forms of embodied epistemologies are where humans have carried the critical traditional ecological knowledge that has enabled us to survive countless climate changes, warfare, and other aspects of living within a dynamic human Earth system. All of this points to the value of working at the level of culture and spirituality, not just technology, policy change, and other forms of organizing. Which is not only about making art about climate change, but letting the responses to climate change come from the same source that creates art, or rather, life itself is a type of art. The process is one of re-enchanting our world. There's a lot more there, and I hope you listen to the longer version in the podcast. While in India, I had the good fortune to enter into a network of ecologically minded changemakers, many of whom were part of the Safe Food Network, the South Indian version of the organic food movement. One of the people I met was Ramasubramanian Oroganti, commonly known as Ram. He has a remarkable wife and a now teenage daughter, Mai, who is quite a talented dancer. We talked a lot about food, millets, which have come from 3,000 to 5,000 years of cultivation and are often much healthier and far more drought resistant than rice. And so in my first time when I was living in Tamil Nadu and working some with Ram and his colleagues, I watched how millets went from being a largely poo-pooed and forgotten food, a food that was considered the food of the poor, and became recognized as a nutritious, vibrant, and often climate resilient food that it is. And in watching that, I found myself eating differently. Food is often the entryway that people one of the best entryways that people have for engaging with both local systems of change and also thinking differently about their relationship to the past, to their bodies, and to the interconnectivity of all of life. It was also there that I learned the importance of the word samanvaya, which I'd like to translate as ancient living harmony, the harmony that was there at the beginning of all time and the harmony that was there at the end. Ram and some of his colleagues are part of a Samanvaya network, and they invited me to use that name as I left India and went to initiate some of my own initiatives in America, where I'm from. And that is part of what led me to come with the name Sequoia Samanvaya. Sequoias, of course, are the ancient redwood trees, often known as redwoods, in the California where I am from. And I have lots of stories about my connection to those sequoias, which I'm not going to share just yet. But let's simply say that I have a deep kinship with them. Sequoia Samanvaya, the name of my organization, came to me as a way of recognizing that part of our task is coming into harmony with ancient living beings, ancient living traditions, such as the giant sequoias. When you listen to Ram's conversation with me, keep an ear out for how he first is describing an seemingly enchanted past. Not a fantasy, not a mythology, but a place where soil and sound and music and food all sing together in harmony. As he keeps talking, he describes his state of Tamil Nadu in a different way, one with much less enchantment today, or perhaps the wrong kind of enchantment, focused on the fantasy of a kind of development that, as he says, produces a lot of waste. He holds out a different vision, a place without waste. He also has strong and clear statements about the integration, he uses the word synthesis, of spiritual and practical ways to create inner and outer change. I have actually done 2 other podcasts with Ram. You can find them both on our Sequoia Summon Bio website, which is always linked into the show notes, wherever you might be finding your podcasts. I should say that the first podcast I did with him about the local economies that were growing in India in response to the global shutdown during the early stages of the pandemic, and how the revitalizing and how those local economies were helping to spur and to strengthen the pre-existing revitalization of organic food movements, and the capacity for local sovereignty has been one of the most popular and downloaded episodes I have recorded to date. Part of what opened up for me in India was a clear vision, desire, and realized skill set to take a professional, spiritual, and religious pathway, not just a secular one, in my work towards addressing the challenges of our times, especially but not only climate change. I didn't just want to talk about working with spirituality and religion, I wanted to do it, not just as someone interested in, and at that time I was deeply engaging with Buddhism and Hinduism, but also from my own tradition, coming out of the Judeo-Christian traditions. I knew that there was a lot in the Christian tradition that I came from that I didn't understand. I had grown up as a Quaker, and Quakers are not particularly known for their church work. We don't really have churches, we have different structure, we have meetings, we have a different way of doing things than most other Christians do. And that is a large part of why I went to seminary. And of course, the first thing in seminary that you learn is the Old Testament. I knew very little about the Old Testament except what I had learned from Bill Moyer's Genesis series when I was a child. I have to admit that after the vibrancy of working in villages in South India, studying the Old Testament in the back of a room in graduate school in a building with very few windows was very unappealing. Fortunately, I had some wonderful professors, and over time, I came to appreciate what scholars often refer to as a Hebrew Bible. In this podcast series, it thus made sense to go from a conversation with Ram about the ancient culture and modern revitalization of the people of the land of Tamil to a rabbi, a teacher of another ancient culture, Judaism. This is not only because my own journey went that way, but because there's a critical point here. The work of ReEnchanting and ReMembering is not only about engaging with cultures outside of the West. It is not only about lifting up Hinduism or indigenous traditions. While encounters with non-Western traditions are often a critical component for Westerners, particularly white settlers, in widening their vantage point, there is much within Western traditions, including especially Judaism, the basis of the Abrahamic traditions, which offers much to both remember and to re-enchant our world. Rabbi Nahum, we originally met while he was co-leading a workshop at Ghost Ranch in New Mexico. In this conversation with me, he talks about a recent book he wrote. When you listen to this episode, notice how Rabbi Nahum is presenting a dynamic and meaningful approach to the Torah. He is moving away from an angry, wrathful God that is often described, and instead describes God. He translates the Hebrew as meaning the living presence. There are similarities and differences in how he approaches the text and the questions of our times to how Ram does it, but both acknowledge the importance of prayer, chanting, and the questioning embodies spiritual life. The next episode is the first of my myth-casting episodes. Hey, oh, hey, oh. Bone Seed Song. In all of my myth casting episodes here, I am taking an ancient myth, usually one with a lot of cross-cultural use, and re-narrating it for our times. And these are directly works of re-enchanting. The ones here are all coming from the remarkable book by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, Women Who Run with the Wolves. Some of you may be familiar with her work, and if you're not, I hope you have a chance to look into it. This one, in particular, captures both remembering and re-enchanting, as the bones are sung over and life comes back to them. And before we say that this is only a folk story, don't forget that Abrahamic traditions also have stories about bones coming back to life through the utterances as well, particularly in Ezekiel chapter 37. The myth I share here emphasizes the close and powerful relationship between women and wolves. What other stories in this podcast does the myth Bone Seed Song evoke? I find resonances in the stories that Ram tells about rivers coming back to life, and the stories Rabbi Nahum tells on the importance of the journey and of being with suffering. Subsequently, later on in the podcast, Reverend Retta Morgan talks about the power of darkness, including the music in the darkness, which also resonates with the work of sitting with the bones of a thing. There is some work that can only be done in the dark, work that can only be done after death. The work of bringing the bits and pieces together is the work of remembering. Like the elder woman in the myth, we pick up the bones of the past and we place them together, finding the pattern, and we sing over them. And through patience and sitting with the bones, we sing a song. A profound transformational experience emerges. A new being comes to life. Working with life is essential. Working with death is essential for creating new life. And so it seems appropriate to place in the series the story of how my father's death transformed my life. I cannot imagine the life I am living now had he not died. It is hard to say that. Sometimes I think I knew. Sometimes I think that he understood the power, the positive power of healing that his death might give me. And sometimes I miss him so much it hurts. I call this episode the time of convergence, although it was more of a whirlwind than a simple joining of rivers. This is the story of how I came to understand the importance of remembering for creating a regenerative society. Remembering as a process that incorporates both the beauty of our interconnection to one another and a remembering of how we are torn apart, the severance that lives in our buildings and our brains and our social mores, in which we understand and perceive ourselves as separate from earth and from one another. Remembering also the importance of theodicy, the questions of why do good people do bad things. This is the story of how I came to recognize that climate change can be originated into the doctrine of discovery instead of the Industrial Revolution, and that origin point makes a difference in how we imagine the past, the present, and the future. It is how I started to retell my own family's origin story, including actively shifting my family's understanding, my understanding, of what it meant that we were amongst the founding families of the United States of America. It led me to write my thesis on reoriginating the Anthropocene into the doctrine of discovery, and to begin teaching classes on remembering these histories. This became the core offering and continues to be the core offering of my organization, Sequoia Samanvaya. This story and the first story I share about re-enchanting are the two stories for this first season. Both are inherently connected to all the other conversations and mythcasts in the season, if for no other reason than because here I share how I come to understand and interpret, and frankly I'm still learning what this phrase means, remembering and re-enchanting. Highlights the work of the remarkable theologian Mark Wallace, who teaches
religion at Swarthmore College, not far from Philadelphia, in the homeland of the Lenape peoples. In this podcast, we discuss his book, When God Was a Bird, which finds the animistic resonances and dynamics within the Old and New Testament. In many ways, Professor Mark is working to find what is in plain sight, a spiritual tradition that is alive with animism, for all that animist traditions have been largely demonized by the past few centuries, even millennia, of Christianity. He comes to this as a Christian. He is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian tradition, a lifelong naturalist and environmentalist, and as someone who is completely, deeply in love with the woodlands and watershed where he lives. This episode pairs perfectly with the earlier episode by Rabbi Nahum. It complements the enchanting themes as well as the remembering themes, resonating with a fluid image of the divine and the human, which we see in subsequent mythcasts as well. Part of our themes in our conversation was a recognition of the birth, death, rebirth cycle so deep within animistic, pagan, and Christian traditions. So I follow this episode with a conversation about real, not metaphorical, birth, death, and renewal. I speak with a midwife and a death doula, two women in the relatively early stages of their career, about their insights into birth and death at the early stages of the pandemic. What are these liminal spaces that they walk alongside with their clients? How do they see their work on the edge of the veil between this world and the next? Christina and Michelle were friends prior to this podcast. This conversation is a testament to the friendship that can grow amongst those who are walking along the many veils of beginnings, endings, and transformational becomings. From this episode, we can move more fully into the dark. Not the darkness of birth or death, both of which have their own darkness, but the actual dark, the time of night, of shadow, of the dark moon, the long nights of winter that are so critical to the seasons here in the Northern Hemisphere. Reverend Retta Morgan is our guide. And we talk about her remarkable work moving into greater comfort with the dark, and with the many ways that white colonized society has taken the dark of the night and turned it into something that represents evil. In this powerful and important conversation, we go into the question of what have we projected onto the dark, and of her work in bringing innocence, gratitude, and blessings back into our relationship with the dark. The next episode is a myth-casting episode, taking the story that probably many of you are familiar with of Demeter and Persephone. I do a slightly different twist of the Greek earth mother goddess Demeter's search for her daughter Persephone after Persephone was stolen by Hades, lord of the underworld. Here I am working with the power of the erotic, not only to create life in the way of the birds and the bees, but to make us laugh, and so at times to help us overcome those times of seemingly insurmountable sadness and despair. I, in a rather perhaps selfish way, hope that you like the artwork that I produce for all the mythcasts. They're all my own images and drawings. And this one was particularly, I really enjoyed making this one. I enjoyed making all of the images for the mythcasting. The next episode is another three-way conversation, this time with Reverend Retta Morgan and Christina Friedlander. If you are listening to the podcast in order, and you certainly don't need to, you would have already heard both women, although in different contexts. This was a particularly beautiful conversation about spiritual midwifery,
a set of skills that I find is increasingly needed as we shepherd institutions, individuals, families, and ourselves into new ways of being together. After this episode, I go to seal skin, or the Selkie myth. This felt like an important myth to share, and I'm curious how you might connect it to other episodes. I like nestling it between the conversation about midwifery, which is always a conversation about working, which is also a conversation about working with water, and a conversation about the transformational nature of brewing with Heather Wolfe. Myths about people, especially women, becoming animals, from swans to seals, or animals becoming humans, from mermaids to selkie, speak not only to childhood fantasies, but to some of the inherent kinship of our species. After this episode, I turn to Heather Wolfe. Heather is a brewist and folk artist whose brews helped launch first a major kombucha company, some substantial ecstatic gatherings, and are an important part of her new initiatives bringing the sacred back into brewing. We had a fascinating conversation about circular time in brewing. Some of it is referencing a ritual that my partner Christine and I had done on circular time at her initial soiree, where she introduced some of her brews. And we used some of the alcoholic brews in our ritual. And it was actually the first time that I had done that. It makes so much sense to find ways of working with plants and plant medicine. And I would absolutely say that her brews are a form of plant medicine in ritual. In fact, it's probably one of the oldest things to do. And because the plants have so much to teach us. Part of what I love about this conversation is that we get really into what is brewing, what are some of the spiritual dynamics of alcohol, and some of the problematic ones. Heather's relationship with plants and how she keeps that relationship in a good way, and how time is part of the entire process. Like me, she loves doing the work of re-enchanting our world and sees folk wisdom, as well as decolonization, as essential to the decision-making processes, the building of community, and the possibilities of survival in a climate-changed world. After this episode, I go to the myth, Skeleton Woman. Which is, of course, a fabulous love story. It is also, as I tell it here, a story about climate change and the plastics in our ocean. It is also about sitting with that part of ourselves and our lover, which is hard and ugly, and sometimes also beautiful. It is about the transforming power of being with. It is about the willingness to change. You will hear the depths of the ocean in this myth as in the sealskin myth, although the movement between sea creatures and humans is different. I have found this myth, as with some of the others, immensely valuable many, many times as we enter into our climate-changed world. I hope that you do too. And we end this series with a conversation with Ramona. Like Heather, Ramona is a female entrepreneur who is using her entrepreneurial insights and skills to revitalize ancient cultures and stir the spiritual imagination. While Heather is working with honey, plants, and techniques of brewing, Ramona has created onesies, a onesies clothing line for babies, sharing the symbols and stories of her Taino ancestral heritage as well as her own poetry. In this conversation, we go deep into her life story, which ranges from working for the military on climate change in the Pacific region while based in Hawaii, to starting the onesies company, Oahala, which is serving the Dominican diaspora, while she herself is based in the South Bronx. There are connections here to the conversations that Ram and I talked about, including the importance of working at the level of institutional ecosystems and the levels of systems change if we have any hope of shifting individual organizations. As she talks about reclaiming, repairing a sacred site, there are resonances with the myth of skeleton women, of falling in love with that which has become often dirty and polluted, and doing the painstaking work of cleaning it up, from years of different forms of neglect until the gleaming heart of a place can once again live. I realize as I'm sharing about these different episodes that I think I have said how wonderful each one is. And I think that there's a way in which when I'm speaking to these people, I become rather enamored with the immense personal, collective, spiritual work that all of them are doing. The process of engaging with decolonization in these different spaces is not always easy. And yet the life-giving results that can emerge are so powerful. Speaking with these individuals, many of whom have been friends, some of whom I have not known as well, have been ways and always encouraging for me to see the extent to which decolonization is part and parcel of a spiritual pathway to addressing climate change. Well, here you go. 14 episodes for our first season of the ReMembering and ReEnchanting podcast. None of which would have actually made it out of my studio had not been for the consistent support of my assistant Michael and the continued support of my partner. Please tell me what you like and what you want more of. What questions do you find yourself asking at whatever intersections you move between, the crossroads you stand upon now? I know I will definitely be diving more into work with ancestors and time, money and property, spirituality and eros, organizational structures and music, wealth, ecology, magic, and love. In other words, into the dynamics and the stuff of our lives, all of which is part of the great turning of our times, and all of which can become part of the great work of remembering and re-enchanting our world. Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.